For decades, Balmoral Castle was more than a royal residence. It was the place where the monarchy removed its armor, where Queen Elizabeth II became not a sovereign on a balcony, but a grandmother in a headscarf, a woman walking through the Scottish air with dogs at her feet and duty still resting quietly on her shoulders. Balmoral was not just stone, land, hunting rooms, private roads, and old photographs. It was memory. It was tradition. It was the one place where the late queen seemed to breathe without the full weight of the crown pressing against her chest. And that is why the latest alleged scandal surrounding Balmoral has sent a tremor through royal watchers, not merely because of what was said to have happened, but because of who was said to have crossed the line. According to claims now circulating in royal circles, Princess Anne was left furious after Camilla's son was allegedly connected to the improper use of Balmoral Castle, a place many inside the family still regard as sacred ground. And if those claims are true, then this is not just a story about access, privilege, or a misunderstanding over royal property. This is a story about boundaries, about old loyalty clashing with new influence, and about one woman in the royal family who has never been afraid to say what everyone else is too polished to admit. Princess Anne has never been the type to perform outrage for cameras. She does not chase sympathy. She does not soften her language for public approval. She is often described as the hardest-working royal, but that phrase barely captures what she represents inside the institution. And is disciplined in human form. She is the daughter who understood her mother not as a symbol, but as a standard. She learned early that monarchy survives not through glamour, but through restraint, not through personal entitlement, but through duty repeated until it becomes instinct. So when a place like Balmoral is allegedly dragged into controversy, Anne's reaction would never be casual. To her, Balmoral is not a backdrop for private ambition. It is not a luxury address to be borrowed, leveraged, or used for anyone's convenience. It is part of the crown's emotional architecture, and in Anne's world, that means it must be protected. What makes this alleged situation explosive is the name attached to it. Camilla's son is not a working royal. He does not carry the burden of royal engagements, military patronages, public scrutiny, or constitutional expectation in the same way senior royals do. He belongs to Camilla's private family circle, a circle that has always existed beside the monarchy, but never fully inside it. And that distinction matters, because the moment someone from that private circle is perceived to be benefiting from royal access, the old wounds begin to reopen. For many people, Camilla's rise from controversial outsider to queen was already one of the most dramatic transformations in modern royal history. Her acceptance was gradual, careful, and never universal. The palace spent years building the image of steadiness around her. But the shadow of the past never entirely disappeared. And now, with this alleged Balmoral controversy, the question becomes sharper. Where does Camilla's private family end? And where does the crown begin? That is reportedly the line Princess Anne refused to let blur. In this version of events, Anne's anger was not simply personal. It was institutional. She was not merely defending a castle. She was defending the principle that royal privilege must not leak outward into private networks. Balmoral, after all, carries the imprint of Queen Elizabeth II more strongly than almost any other royal estate. It was where she spent her final days. It was where the family gathered in grief after her passing. It was where the nation's longest reigning monarch quietly left the world. To use Balmoral carelessly, or to appear to use it for personal gain, would feel to and like more than poor judgment. It would feel like disrespect. And that is where the story becomes dangerous for King Charles. Because Charles is not just the monarch in this drama. He is the husband of Camilla, the brother of Anne, and the son of the late queen whose memory still governs the emotional code of the family. If and truly push this matter into a legal or formal confrontation, then Charles would be trapped between two versions of loyalty. On one side stands his wife, whose private family he has tried to normalize within the broader royal landscape. On the other stands Anne, the sister who has rarely embarrassed the institution, rarely demanded attention, and rarely lost moral ground inside the family. When and speaks, people listen, not because she is loud, but because she almost never wastes words. The alleged involvement of a court process, whether formal, threatened, or exaggerated by insiders, gives this story its sharpest edge. A royal family can survive gossip. It can survive cold shoulders, tense dinners, and carefully worded denials. But court language changes everything. It suggests records, accountability, documents, questions, and consequences. It removes the drama from the drawing room and places it under a harsher light. And if Balmoral is truly at the center of that scrutiny, then the palace faces a nightmare it cannot easily polish away. Because Balmoral is not just another property. It is the emotional shrine of the Elizabethan era. So the real question is not whether Princess Anne was angry. Anyone who understands her loyalty to the late Queen would expect nothing less. The real question is whether this alleged Balmoral scandal has exposed something far deeper inside the monarchy. A quiet struggle over who is allowed to stand near royal power, who is allowed to benefit from royal proximity, and who has the courage to say enough. Princess Anne may not wear the crown, but in moments like this, she becomes something just as formidable, the keeper of the line. And if that line was crossed at Balmoral, then Camilla's family may have discovered that the most dangerous royal enemy is not the one who gives interviews, leaks stories, or seeks revenge in public. It is the one who stays silent for years, watches everything, remembers everything, and then, when the monarchy's dignity is at stake, finally moves. What makes Princess Anne's reported response so powerful is that it fits the pattern of a woman who has spent her entire life understanding the difference between family comfort and institutional survival. And was born into privilege, yes, but she was also born into a system that taught her one hard lesson before almost anyone else learned it. The monarchy does not belong to the individuals who live inside it. It belongs to the continuity they are expected to protect. That is why this alleged Balmoral dispute cuts so deeply. To an outsider, a castle may look like wealth. And Balmoral is not merely an estate. It is a covenant. It is a private promise between the royal family and the memory of Queen Elizabeth II that certain places, certain rituals, and certain boundaries must remain untouched by personal convenience. And if Camilla's son truly became associated with using that space in a way and considered inappropriate, then her reaction would not come from jealousy, rivalry, or drama. It would come from something colder and more dangerous, principle. For years, and watch the monarchy bend itself around one crisis after another. She saw Diana become both beloved and wounded by the institution. She saw Charles wait decades for the throne while the public questioned his judgment, his marriage, and his future. She saw Andrew's scandals poison the family name. She saw Harry and Meghan walk away, then turn personal grievances into global spectacle. Through all of it, and remained one of the few figures who seemed unchanged. She did not reinvent herself for every new media cycle. She did not try to become fashionable. She did not ask the public to understand her feelings. She simply worked. That kind of consistency gives her a rare authority. When and is said to be angry, people do not dismiss it as emotional noise. They wonder what rule has been broken. That is why the alleged involvement of Balmoral is so symbolically devastating. Balmoral is where the late Queen's reign feels most human. It is not Buckingham Palace, designed for statecraft and ceremony. It is not Windsor Castle, loaded with monarchy's grandeur and public pageantry. Balmoral is quieter, more personal, more intimate. It is the place where the royal family has traditionally retreated from performance. But precisely because it is private, it also requires trust. Access to Balmoral has always carried meaning. Being invited there is not the same as booking a hotel room or borrowing a weekend house. It signals belonging. It signals acceptance. It signals proximity to the heart of the family. So if someone outside the working royal structure is perceived to have used that proximity improperly, the concern becomes much larger than the act itself. It becomes a question of who is being allowed to treat royal inheritance as private opportunity. Camilla's position makes that question even more sensitive. Her journey into the royal family was never simple. She did not enter as a young bride beloved by the public. She entered through controversy, patience, calculation, and gradual normalization. Over time, the palace reframed her image from the woman blamed for heartbreak into the steady partner beside Charles. That transformation required discipline from the royal machine. Every public appearance mattered. Every title mattered. Every step toward acceptance was managed carefully. But Camilla's children have always occupied a complicated space. They're connected to the queen, but they're not royal in the constitutional sense. They're close to the throne emotionally, but not structurally. They stand near power without carrying the same public duty that justifies royal privilege. And that is exactly the kind of gray zone princess Anne would instinctively distrust. In Anne's world, status must be paid for in service. Access must be justified by responsibility. Privilege without duty is not harmless. It is corrosive. It weakens the moral argument that allows monarchy to survive in the modern age. The public may accept palaces, titles, carriages, and ceremony when they believe those who receive them are bound by obligation. But when privilege appears to spread outward to people who do not carry that burden, resentment follows quickly. And knows this. She has lived long enough to see how one careless story can become a national mood. She understands that monarchy is not destroyed only by revolutions. Sometimes it is weakened by small permissions, quiet exceptions, and family favors that look insignificant until the public finally connects them. That may explain why, in this alleged story, Anne's response feels less like a sister's irritation and more like a warning shot. She is not merely saying that Balmoral was misused. She is reportedly making a broader point. The crown cannot become a private shelter for extended family convenience. Camilla may be queen, but that does not automatically make every person connected to her part of the royal operating system. There is a difference between being loved by a monarch and being entitled to royal spaces. There is a difference between family warmth and institutional access. And, more than almost anyone, would insist that those differences remain visible. And for Charles, that creates a painful dilemma. His reign has already been defined by transition. He inherited not only the throne, but the emotional aftermath of his mother's death, the unresolved tension with Harry, questions over Andrew, and the delicate task of positioning Camilla as queen without reopening old public wounds. The last thing he needs is a dispute suggesting that Camilla's private family is testing the limits of royal privilege, yet ignoring and would be equally dangerous. She is not a marginal figure. She is trusted by the public, respected by staff, and associated with the late queen's values more strongly than many who rank above her in the line of succession. So beneath the alleged legal drama lies a much deeper royal crisis. This is not just about whether Camilla's son did or did not use Balmoral improperly. It is about what Balmoral represents after Queen Elizabeth II's death. Who controls the emotional legacy of the late queen? Who decides what is acceptable inside spaces she cherished? And who has the authority to stop the monarchy from drifting into arrangements that may benefit individuals but damage the institution? Princess Anne's answer, if the reports are to be believed, is brutally clear. She may not seek power, but she knows when power is being mishandled. And when the line runs through Balmoral, she will not step aside simply to keep the peace. Inside the royal family, conflict is rarely announced in the language of conflict. It arrives through absences, delayed invitations, carefully adjusted seating plans, softened statements, and doors that once opened easily but suddenly require permission. That is why the alleged Balmoral dispute carries such a sharp sense of danger. If Princess Anne truly decided that Camilla's son had crossed a line, she would not need to shout across a palace corridor to make her point. Anne's power has always been quieter than that. She understands the machinery of the monarchy too well. She knows which private secretaries speak to which offices, which estate managers control which approvals, which legal advisors can turn a family irritation into a formal matter. And that is what makes her so formidable. She is not reckless. She is not theatrical. She is precise. If and moves, she moves because she believes the matter has already passed the point of polite correction. The alleged issue around Balmoral would have struck at several layers at once. First, there is the property itself. Balmoral is privately owned by the monarch, not a government palace in the same sense as Buckingham Palace. That makes its management more personal, but not less sensitive. In fact, it becomes more sensitive because personal royal spaces depend heavily on trust and discretion. What happens there is meant to remain protected from commercial temptation, social climbing, or private exploitation. Second, there is the timing. After Queen Elizabeth II's death, Balmoral became emotionally untouchable in a way it had not been before. It was no longer just a beloved retreat. It became the final chapter of her reign. Every room, every photograph, every path through the estate seemed to carry the echo of her last days. For Anne, who was one of the late Queen's most loyal children, any alleged misuse of that space would feel like an intrusion into grief itself. But the third layer is the most dangerous: Camilla. Not because Camilla personally needed to be accused of anything, but because her name changes the emotional temperature of every story connected to access and legitimacy. For supporters of the Queen, Camilla represents endurance, maturity, and the stability Charles wanted beside him. For critics, she still represents the unresolved pain of the Diana years, the woman whose path into the monarchy came at a cost the public never fully forgot. That divided perception means any controversy involving Camilla's family does not remain small. It becomes a referendum on whether her rise has brought too much private influence too close to the crown. And if Anne is positioned as the person resisting that influence, then the story gains a dramatic structure almost no palace spokesperson can easily neutralize: the late Queen's daughter versus the Queen consort's private circle. That contrast is potent because Anne and Camilla represent two very different forms of royal survival. Camilla survived through patience, silence, and gradual rehabilitation, and survived through work, discipline, and refusal to sentimentalize herself. Camilla's public acceptance was carefully built. Anne's was earned almost accidentally, through decades of showing up without demanding applause. Camilla had to be explained to the public, and never did. And in a monarchy where credibility is becoming more valuable than glamour, that difference matters. If Anne is seen as protecting Balmoral, the public instinctively understands the symbolism. She becomes the guard at the gate of the old monarchy, the daughter who remembers what her mother would and would not have tolerated. For Camilla's son, the alleged controversy would be damaging precisely because his position is unofficial. A working royal can be criticized, but at least the public understands why they are near the institution. A private family member has less room for error. Any perceived use of royal connection can look like privilege without accountability. That is the phrase no modern monarchy wants attached to it. Privilege without accountability is the acid that eats through public consent. It invites people to ask why titles, estates, and guarded traditions should be respected if access can be quietly extended to those who carry none of the public burden. Anne's alleged anger, therefore, would not merely be moral. It would be strategic. She would understand that allowing one exception can create a precedent, and precedent is everything in royal life. That is why the word court, even if used loosely in circulating claims, gives the story a darker force. A family dispute can be denied. A rumor can be ignored. But the suggestion of legal escalation implies that someone wanted a boundary recorded, not just discussed. It suggests that Anne, or those aligned with her view, may have wanted the matter taken out of the emotional gray zone and placed into a framework of rules. That would be devastating for palace optics. The monarchy survives by making its internal hierarchy look natural, almost effortless. But legal language exposes the seams. It reminds the world that behind the velvet curtains are documents, permissions, ownership structures, liabilities, and people fighting over access like any other powerful family. For Charles, the nightmare would be not only the dispute itself, but the choice it forces him to make. If he protects Camilla's son too openly, He risks appearing to place his wife's private family above the standards his mother lived by. If he sides with, and too strongly, he risks humiliating Camilla and confirming that her family remains outside the true royal circle. If he stays silent, he looks weak. This is the kind of crisis that monarchy hates most because there is no clean public answer. Every option wounds someone. Every gesture signals allegiance. And that may be why Princess Anne's alleged role feels so dramatic. She is not trying to become the center of the story. She becomes the center because everyone else appears compromised. Charles is emotionally conflicted. Camilla is symbolically exposed. Her son is vulnerable because he lacks official standing. The palace is constrained by its own need for silence, and alone can occupy the position of unsentimental guardian. She can say, without saying it publicly, that Balmoral is not a social asset, not a family favor, and not a stage for private advantage. It is part of the monarchy's moral inheritance. So as whispers spread and the alleged confrontation grows in public imagination, the deeper question becomes impossible to avoid. Was this really about one man's access to one royal estate? Or was it the first visible sign of a larger correction inside the House of Windsor? Perhaps Princess Anne saw something others wanted to ignore. That after Queen Elizabeth II, the monarchy's greatest danger is not open rebellion, but slow dilution. A little more informality here, a little more private benefit there, one blurred boundary after another until the crown begins to look less like an institution and more like a family business. And if that is what Anne believed was happening, then dragging the issue into formal confrontation would not be cruelty. It would be her final warning. The monarchy may modernize, but it cannot survive if it forgets where the line is. What few people understand about Princess Anne is that her loyalty has never been soft. It is not the kind of loyalty that smiles for photographs, repeats comforting phrases, and pretends every family tension can be solved by silence. Anne's loyalty is harder than that. It is protective, practical, and sometimes brutal. She does not defend the monarchy by pretending its problems do not exist. She defends it by refusing to let personal emotion weaken the rules that keep the institution standing. And that is why this alleged Balmoral confrontation feels so believable to those who have watched her for decades. If and believe Camilla's son had benefited from access he should never have had, or used Balmoral in a way that damaged the dignity of the estate, she would not waste time dressing the matter in polite language. She would see it as a breach. And once Anne sees a breach, she does not look away. Balmoral, in this story, becomes more than a castle. It becomes a test. It tests how much influence Camilla's private family now has around the edges of royal life. It tests whether Charles can separate his role as husband from his duty as monarch. It tests whether the late Queen's standards still carry authority after her death, or whether they are slowly being softened by new personal arrangements. And most of all, it tests whether anyone inside the family still has the nerve to say no. Because monarchy is not only weakened by scandal, it is weakened by hesitation. It is weakened when everyone sees a problem, but everyone waits for someone else to confront it. And has never been that kind of royal. Her entire life has been a rejection of decorative weakness. She works, she observes, she remembers, and when necessary, she cuts through the fog. For Camilla, the alleged controversy is especially dangerous because it touches the one issue her public image has always had to avoid, the perception that her personal world has gained too much access to royal privilege. Camilla's transformation into queen required years of careful acceptance. It did not happen overnight. It was built through restraint, through service, through the gradual lowering of public resistance. But that acceptance has always depended on a delicate understanding. Camilla could stand beside Charles as queen, but her private family would not become a second royal family. Her children could be acknowledged, respected, and included in certain personal moments, but they could not appear to draw from the same reservoir of privilege as working royals. That boundary is not just symbolic. It is essential. Without it, critics can argue that the monarchy is no longer a disciplined institution, but a network of personal connections. That is the fear and would understand instantly. She knows how quickly public trust can turn. She knows the British public may tolerate wealth, ceremony, and inheritance when those things are tied to duty, service, and sacrifice. But they become far less forgiving when privilege appears casual, inherited by proximity, or extended through marriage without public obligation. If the alleged Balmoral incident suggested that Camilla's son had stepped too close to royal advantage, Anne's response would not be about punishing him personally. It would be about stopping the precedent before it hardened into entitlement. In royal life, one exception can become a custom if no one challenges it. One quiet permission can become a future expectation. One blurred line can invite others to push further. Anne's instinct would be to shut the door before anyone began treating it as open. And then there is the ghost in the room, Queen Elizabeth II. Her presence dominates this alleged story even though she is gone. Balmoral was where she died, but more importantly, it was where she lived most freely. It represented her personal rhythm, her connection to Scotland, her belief in continuity, and her quiet resistance to the noisy modern world. For Anne, defending Balmoral would be almost the same as defending her mother's final sanctuary. That emotional dimension cannot be overstated. This is not simply about walls and land. It is about the memory of a monarch who gave her entire life to restraint. If Anne felt that memory was being handled carelessly, her anger would be layered with grief, duty, and perhaps even regret that her mother was no longer there to enforce the standards herself. In that sense, Anne's alleged move toward formal action could be read as a message to the whole family. The Queen may be gone, but her rules are not. That message would land heavily inside palace walls. It would remind Charles that inheritance is not only about receiving power. It is about preserving the discipline that came with it. It would remind Camilla that queenship, however hard-won, does not erase the need for boundaries. It would remind every private relative hovering near the royal orbit that proximity is not permission. And it would remind the public that at least one senior royal still understands the difference between family privilege and constitutional dignity. The emotional cost of such a confrontation, however, would be severe. Anne and Charles have survived a lifetime of royal pressure together. They are siblings shaped by the same mother, the same institution, and the same relentless expectation. And challenging a situation tied to Camilla's son would not be a small domestic disagreement. It would pierce Charles at the most vulnerable point of his reign, the place where love, loyalty, guilt, and kingship all collide. Charles spent much of his life fighting for Camilla's acceptance. He waited, endured criticism, and eventually brought her to the throne beside him. To have Anne, one of the most respected figures in the family, appear to draw a hard line around Camilla's private circle would be painful. It would suggest that even after all these years, the monarchy still distinguishes between Camilla the Queen and Camilla's family. But perhaps that distinction is exactly what Anne believes must be preserved. A monarchy cannot afford emotional confusion. It cannot allow affection to rewrite structure. It cannot let private relationships create public ambiguity. Anne's alleged anger, then, is not anti-Camilla in the simple sense. It is pro-institution. It says that even the king's wife, even the queen, even those closest to the throne, must understand that royal spaces are not personal currency. Balmoral cannot become a symbol of soft access. It must remain what it was under Elizabeth II, a place of retreat, duty, memory, and guarded belonging. So as the alleged scandal deepens, Princess Anne emerges not as a troublemaker, but as the monarchy's internal alarm bell. She is the figure who warns that something sacred is being mishandled before the public fully grasps the damage. And if her warning sounds harsh, it is because she knows the stakes. The monarchy has survived wars, divorces, abdication, grief, and rebellion. But it survives only when its privileges appear disciplined by duty. Remove that discipline, and the castles become symbols not of continuity, but of excess. That is why Anne's alleged stand over Balmoral matters. She is not merely asking who used the castle. She is asking what kind of monarchy Charles intends to leave behind. The most dangerous part of this alleged Balmoral confrontation is not the possibility of a legal dispute. It is what such a dispute would reveal about the private architecture of the royal family after Queen Elizabeth II. For 70 years, the late Queen was the final wall. Her presence alone controlled behavior. People might complain, maneuver, leak, or resent one another, but everyone understood there was a limit beyond which the Queen's disapproval became unbearable. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to explain herself. Her authority was atmospheric. It filled rooms before she entered them. But after her death, that invisible discipline weakened. Suddenly, old rivalries had room to breathe. New arrangements could be tested. Personal circles could move closer to the center. And Balmoral, once protected by the Queen's living presence, became vulnerable to a new question. Who now guards what she left behind? That is why Princess Anne's alleged anger feels like more than a reaction. It feels like a succession of values. Charles inherited the crown, but it inherited something harder to define: the late Queen's intolerance for foolishness. Anne does not have the throne, but she has the memory of how the throne was supposed to behave. She remembers the discipline, the emotional restraint, the refusal to let private needs embarrass public duty. And in this alleged scandal, that memory becomes her weapon. If Camilla's son was perceived to have treated Balmoral as something accessible through family proximity, and would see not only an individual mistake, but a symptom of a larger drift, the monarchy, in her eyes, cannot become casual about its own symbols. It cannot survive if the people around it begin to mistake closeness for entitlement. The reported tension would also expose a truth the palace rarely wants spoken aloud. Not everyone connected to the royal family belongs equally inside the royal system. That may sound harsh, but monarchy depends on hierarchy. It depends on defined roles, visible obligations, and controlled access. A working royal may use royal spaces because they serve the institution. A monarch may invite private relatives because family life still exists behind the crown. But when that invitation begins to look like a channel of benefit, the structure becomes unstable. Camilla's children occupy precisely this sensitive borderland. They are close enough to attract fascination, but not official enough to justify privilege in the public mind. That makes any allegation involving royal property especially volatile. The public does not only ask, what happened? They ask, why was he there? Who allowed it? What else has been allowed? For Camilla, those questions would be deeply uncomfortable. Her queenship has always depended on careful separation between her official role and her private past. The monarchy could present her as Charles's partner, a senior figure, a woman who endured decades of hostility and eventually found public steadiness. But it could not easily present her private family as part of the royal structure. That is the unspoken bargain. Camilla may be queen, but her children do not become royal by emotional association. They may attend a coronation. They may support their mother privately. They may appear in the background of family life. But they cannot appear to draw from the privileges of the crown without triggering old suspicion. And Princess Anne, who has spent her life watching public perception sharpen into public judgment, would know exactly how quickly that suspicion could spread. The alleged court element, whether literal or dramatized by those repeating the story, serves as a symbol of Anne's seriousness. In royal language, taking something formal is almost an act of war. Families argue privately. Palaces brief discreetly. Senior aides smooth over tensions. But formal action means someone has decided that silence is no longer enough. It means the issue is no longer about hurt feelings, but about boundaries that must be documented. If, and push for accountability, it would suggest that she believed the risk of ignoring the matter was greater than the damage caused by confronting it. That is a very Anne-like calculation. She would rather endure discomfort now than permit decay later. And this is where Charles's position becomes almost tragic. His reign was supposed to represent continuity after loss, a calm transition from Elizabethan stability into a more modern monarchy. But his personal history makes calm difficult. Every issue connected to Camilla carries decades of emotional residue. Every question involving her family reawakens the old narrative that the monarchy had worked so hard to bury. Charles may want to protect his wife from humiliation. He may want to show that Camilla is not merely tolerated, but fully accepted. Yet he also knows that Anne's credibility cannot be dismissed. If and believes a line has been crossed, Charles cannot simply treat her as a difficult sister. She is one of the most respected senior royals alive, and more importantly, she represents the standards of the mother whose death still defines his reign. That is what makes this alleged confrontation so painful. Both sides can believe they are defending loyalty. Charles may believe he is defending his wife and the blended family reality of his later life. Camilla may believe her children should not be treated forever as outsiders simply because of history, and may believe she is defending the crown from precisely the kind of blurred privilege that weakens public trust. None of these positions is emotionally simple. But monarchy does not operate on emotional fairness. It operates on perception, precedent, and discipline. And on those terms, Anne's argument becomes difficult to defeat. Balmoral is not an ordinary family house. It is a royal symbol, and symbols do not survive careless handling. If the palace tried to minimize the alleged incident, and would likely see that as part of the problem. Minimization is useful in public relations, but dangerous in governance. A scandal buried too quickly can become a precedent protected by silence. A mistake forgiven without correction can become a permission granted in practice. Anne's life has been shaped by the understanding that the monarchy's greatest strength is not popularity, but control over its own standards. Once those standards become negotiable, the institution begins losing authority from within. So Part 5 of this unfolding drama brings us to the coldest possibility. Perhaps Princess Anne's alleged confrontation was never truly about Camilla's son alone. Perhaps he was merely the visible point of a much larger concern. Perhaps Anne saw, in the Balmoral allegation, a warning sign that the monarchy after Elizabeth was becoming too emotionally loose, too dependent on personal arrangements, too willing to blur the distinction between royal duty and private family benefit. And if that is what she saw, then her reaction was not an explosion. It was an intervention. She was not dragging a man into conflict for the sake of revenge. She was dragging a hidden problem into the light before it became a royal habit. In the House of Windsor, habits become traditions, traditions become expectations, and expectations become almost impossible to reverse. And knows this better than anyone. That is why, when Balmoral's name was allegedly touched by impropriety, she did not merely defend Castle. She defended the future shape of the crown. By the time a royal dispute reaches the language of lawyers, even unofficially, the damage has usually already been done. The real crisis is rarely the document, the hearing, the threat, or the formal complaint. The real crisis is the breakdown of private trust that made those steps feel necessary in the first place. That is what gives this alleged Balmoral scandal its deeper tension. If Princess Anne truly reached the point where she believed Camilla's son needed to be challenged formally, then something far more serious had happened behind palace walls than a simple misunderstanding over access. Someone had failed to listen. Someone had dismissed a warning. Someone had treated a sacred boundary as if it could be negotiated. And Anne, who has never had much patience for royal self-indulgence, may have decided that the old quiet methods were no longer enough. For years, the royal family survived by keeping its most dangerous disagreements invisible. The public saw balcony appearances, jubilees, funerals, weddings, and carefully staged unity. But behind those images were offices, advisors, legal teams, estate managers, and private secretaries all working to contain the emotional disorder of a family that also happens to be an institution. That dual nature is what makes every royal conflict so complicated. In an ordinary family, a dispute over a house might be personal. In the House of Windsor, a dispute over Balmoral becomes constitutional theater emotional inheritance, public morality, and media warfare all at once. It becomes a question not only of who did what, but of what the monarchy is willing to tolerate. Anne's alleged position is powerful because she can frame the issue in institutional terms. She does not need to make it about Camilla personally. She does not need to attack Camilla's son as an individual. She only needs to ask one devastating question: who authorized this? And under what principle? That question is dangerous because it cuts through sentiment. It does not care whether Charles wanted peace. It does not care whether Camilla felt protective of her child. It does not care whether aides hoped the issue would disappear quietly. It demands a rule. And if there is no clear rule, then the monarchy has a problem. Because an institution without clear boundaries becomes vulnerable to the strongest personality in the room, and has spent her life resisting precisely that kind of disorder. Camilla's defenders might argue that the criticism is unfair, that her children have been placed in an impossible position, close enough to be scrutinized, but not official enough to be protected. They might say that Camilla has already endured decades of public punishment for the past, and that every story involving her family is instantly twisted into evidence of ambition or intrusion. There is truth in that discomfort. Camilla's private family did not choose the monarchy in the same way working royals are born into it or married into official duty. They became attached to it through Charles's long personal history. But that is exactly why their position requires caution. The closer they stand to royal privilege, the more disciplined they must appear. They cannot afford ambiguity. They cannot afford the perception of casual access. And Balmoral, of all places, is the worst possible setting for ambiguity, because Balmoral is emotional territory. It is where Queen Elizabeth II's story ended. It is where the public imagines the late queen not in diamonds, but in tartan, raincoats, and quiet endurance. It is where the monarchy's most human image still lives. Any alleged misuse of Balmoral feels larger than a property issue because it touches grief. It suggests that the late queen's sanctuary has become vulnerable after her death, that the rule she embodied may no longer be strong enough to protect what she loved. For Anne, that would be almost unbearable, not because she is sentimental in a soft way, but because she understands the political power of memory. Elizabeth II remains the monarchy's strongest moral asset. If the family mishandles the symbols attached to her, it weakens the very foundation Charles relies on. This is why Charles's silence, whether real or perceived, becomes part of the drama. A king's silence is never empty. It is interpreted. It is measured. It is filled by everyone else's assumptions. If Charles says nothing, critics may assume he is shielding Camilla. If he speaks too sharply, he risks exposing family division. If he allows Anne's position to dominate, he may appear unable to control his own household. If he suppresses her concerns, he risks alienating the one sibling whose public credibility remains remarkably intact. In every direction, Charles faces loss. That is the tragedy of kingship. Personal loyalty becomes public evidence, and, however, has less to lose in the court of public perception. She is not trying to protect a romantic narrative. She is not trying to rehabilitate an image. She is not trying to secure popularity through softness. Her reputation was built on endurance, not charm. That gives her freedom others do not have. She can be severe without appearing unstable. She can be blunt without seeming theatrical. She can defend rules without sounding self-serving. And in a monarchy increasingly criticized for privilege, and severity may actually become an asset. She reminds people that not everyone inside the palace treats royal life as an entitlement. If this alleged confrontation continued to escalate, the palace would likely try to reduce it to a misunderstanding, a matter of procedure, or a private family issue. But the public would hear something else. They would hear that princess and daughter of the late queen believed Balmoral had been mishandled. That alone is enough to transform the narrative. Because Anne's moral authority comes from proximity to Elizabeth II's discipline. She is credible not because she is perfect, but because she has been consistent. And consistency is rare in royal life. So the deeper meaning of Part 6 is this. Princess Anne's alleged stand is not merely an act of anger. It is an act of preservation. She is drawing a boundary around the monarchy at a moment when boundaries are becoming dangerously soft. She is reminding Charles that love cannot be allowed to rearrange institutional rules. She is reminding Camilla that queenship comes with restraint not only for herself, but for everyone orbiting her position. And she's reminding the extended royal circle that access is not ownership, proximity is not authority, and Balmoral is not a prize to be used. If and truly dragged this matter toward formal confrontation, then she was not trying to embarrass the family. She was trying to prevent something worse, the slow transformation of royal inheritance into private convenience. And in her world, that is not a family matter. That is a threat to the crown itself. By the final stage of this alleged Balmoral drama, the question is no longer whether Princess Anne was angry or whether Camilla's son understood the weight of the place he was accused of misusing. The deeper question is what this controversy reveals about the monarchy after Queen Elizabeth II. For 70 years, the late Queen gave the royal family a center of gravity. Even when scandals broke, even when marriages collapsed, even when public trust shook, she remained the fixed point. Her presence allowed the institution to survive contradictions because people believed she still represented discipline, sacrifice, and continuity. But after her passing, the monarchy entered a more fragile era. Charles inherited the throne, but he did not inherit the same unquestioned emotional authority. Camilla became queen, but her acceptance still required careful balance. William prepared for the future, but he was not yet in command. And, without seeking power, became one of the last living reminders of the old code. That is why her alleged intervention over Balmoral carries such symbolic force. She is not simply reacting to one incident. She is asking whether the family still remembers what monarchy costs. Balmoral is the perfect place for that question to surface, because Balmoral is where the crown feels most personal. It is the royal family stripped of state ceremony, but not stripped of meaning. Its privacy is not casual. It is sacred because it holds the emotional memory of generations. Queen Elizabeth II did not merely visit Balmoral. She belonged to it. She associated it with routine, quiet, family, horses, dogs, landscapes, and the rare chance to exist beyond the daily theater of monarchy. Then, in her final days, Balmoral became something more, the place where a reign ended. That transformed the estate forever. After that moment, any allegation involving improper access or careless use could never be treated as ordinary. It would feel like a disturbance in the room where history had only recently gone silent. This is where Princess Anne's role becomes almost mythic. She is the royal who does not need to explain her loyalty because it has been demonstrated across a lifetime. She did not turn her service into a brand. She did not ask the public to witness her emotional sacrifices. She simply remained. In an era of interviews, documentaries, memoirs, leaks, image repair, and carefully curated vulnerability, Anne's power comes from refusal. She refuses to dramatize herself, which makes every reported act of severity feel more meaningful. If she was prepared to challenge Camilla's son over Balmoral, even through formal or legal pressure, then many would assume she had reached that point only after every quieter option had failed, and does not waste her anger. She saves it for moments when the standard itself is under threat. For Camilla, the alleged fallout would be a painful reminder that her queenship, however official, does not erase the emotional complexity of her arrival. She may wear the crown beside Charles, but the monarchy's memory is longer than a coronation. The public has become more accepting, perhaps even warmer toward her, but acceptance is not the same as unlimited trust. Her private family remains a sensitive subject because it sits outside the formal logic of royal duty. That does not mean her children deserve hostility. It means their proximity to royal life must be handled with extraordinary care. One perceived overstep can revive the old unease. the fear that personal history has moved too deeply into institutional privilege. And if Balmoral is the setting, the unease becomes sharper because the estate belongs emotionally to the late Queen's legacy more than to anyone else's convenience. Charles, meanwhile, will be left facing the loneliest truth of kingship. Every private choice becomes a public symbol. As a husband, he may want to shield Camilla and spare her family humiliation. As a brother, he may understand Anne's fury and know that her instincts are rarely frivolous. As a monarch, he must protect the crown from appearing loose, indulgent, or captured by private loyalties. These roles do not easily coexist. The king cannot simply be a man defending his wife. He cannot simply be a son honoring his mother. He cannot simply be a brother negotiating family tension. He must be all of these things at once, and in that impossible combination, even silence becomes a decision. The alleged confrontation also sends a message to everyone orbiting royal power. The age of soft assumption may be ending. Under Elizabeth II, the rules were often unspoken because her authority made them obvious. After her death, unspoken rules may no longer be enough. They may need to be enforced, clarified, and defended by people willing to absorb discomfort, and appears, in this narrative, as that enforcer. She does not stand in front of cameras demanding accountability. She stands behind the institution, where the real decisions are made, and insists that royal privilege must remain tied to royal responsibility. That principle may sound old-fashioned, but it is the only argument that keeps monarchy defensible in a modern democratic society. If privilege drifts away from duty, the crown loses its moral shield. So if this alleged Balmoral case has any lasting meaning, it is not in the sensational image of princess and dragging Camilla's son into court. It is in the sharper image beneath it, and drawing a line through the heart of the royal family, and saying that some things cannot be borrowed, softened, or explained away. Balmoral cannot become a casual extension of private influence. Queen Elizabeth II's memory cannot be treated as decorative inheritance. The crown cannot afford to let personal relationships blur the standards that justify its existence. And Camilla's family, however close to the king, cannot be allowed to stand in the glow of monarchy without understanding the shadows that come with it. In the end, Princess Anne's alleged stand may be remembered less as an act of conflict than as an act of warning. She is telling the family that the monarchy's danger does not always come from enemies outside the palace gates. Sometimes it comes from comfort, from entitlement, from people assuming that because a door opened once, it must remain open forever, and knows better. She was raised by a queen who understood that monarchy survives by refusing to confuse personal desire with public duty. And if Balmoral became the place where that confusion finally surfaced, then Anne's reaction was inevitable. She was not defending stone walls. She was defending a code. She was defending her mother's silence. She was defending the future from the slow erosion of standards. And whether the palace admits it or not, that may be why this alleged scandal cuts so deeply. Because behind the drama, behind the names, behind the whispers of courtrooms and family betrayal, stands one unforgiving truth. The crown can survive anger. It can survive embarrassment. But it cannot survive if the people closest to it forget that privilege without restraint is not royalty. It is decay.